Black girl returns a billionaire's scarf at a train station. Then he freezes in recognition. Nobody believed her. Until it was too late. Child. Alone on a platform. She held something that wasn't hers. Something small. Something silk. Something worth more than her entire neighborhood. She walked toward the man in the suit. He turned around. And the color drained from his face. Not from surprise. Not from gratitude. From terror. Why would a billionaire be terrified of a 3-year-old girl? Why did his bodyguard reach for his earpiece the moment she spoke? Why did the security camera footage from that platform get deleted within 6 hours? She didn't know what she was carrying. She didn't know what she had just triggered. But he did. And in that single frozen moment on Platform 9, a secret buried for 35 years began crawling back to the surface. Don't look away. You need to hear this. Hey, welcome back, and oh, do I have something for you today. Pull in close, because what I'm about to share is the kind of story that doesn't come around often. I need you to ask yourself, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments because people from everywhere need to hear this one. And if you're new here, subscribe right now. Stories like this, they come once. You don't want to miss what's coming in the next few minutes. Let's go. The scarf appeared before the girl did. It drifted off the edge of the platform bench like a whisper. Dark burgundy silk, hand-stitched with a pattern so intricate it looked like a secret language. It fell onto the cold concrete of Northgate Central Station at exactly 7:42 in the morning, and nobody moved to pick it up. Nobody except her. Her name was Amara, 3 years old, barely tall enough to reach a door handle. She wore a yellow coat with 2 mismatched buttons, one white, one blue, and her hair was braided in 4 neat plaits tied with matching yellow ribbons. Her grandmother, Nana Celeste, had turned away for only a moment. Just a moment. She'd bent down to retrieve her fallen train ticket from beneath the bench, and when she straightened back up, Amara was already moving. The station was alive with the brutal rhythm of Monday morning. Heels clicking, coffee cups steaming, a garbled announcement bouncing off vaulted ceilings that hadn't been cleaned since 1987. The smell of diesel, pastry grease, and cold air folded together into something almost suffocating. Northgate Central wasn't beautiful. It was functional in the way that tired things are, doing its job barely and with no interest in being noticed. But Amara noticed everything. She noticed the scarf. She noticed the color of it like the inside of a dark rose. She noticed the gold thread running through the stitching that caught the overhead light and threw tiny sparks across the platform floor. She picked it up with both small hands, the way children handle things they recognize as important, with a gravity that adults forget exists in them. Can you imagine being that platform right now? Watching a 3-year-old carry something she has no idea could detonate a man's entire life? Nana Celeste spotted her immediately. Amara, baby, put that down, that belongs to someone. But Amara had already spotted him. He was standing 30 feet away near the platform entrance. 6'2". A charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Silver cufflinks. Dark shoes with a mirror polish. A jaw set like carved stone. He was speaking into a phone with a kind of low, controlled urgency that wealthy men use when they want to intimidate without raising their voice. His name, though Amara did not know this, could not know this, was Dominic Ashford. 38 years old. CEO of Ashford Capital Group. A man whose photograph appeared in financial magazines next to words like visionary and untouchable. Amara walked toward him. The scarf was trailing slightly behind her, one silken end brushing the concrete. Dominic was mid-sentence when he saw her. The Singapore deal closes by Thursday or I want. He stopped. Not slowed. Not paused. Up. Like a clock someone had physically reached into and halted. His eyes dropped to the scarf. Then to her face. And something happened to his expression that had nothing to do with a missing piece of expensive fabric. It was the look of a man who has spent years constructing a wall around a single terrible thing, and has just heard the first crack in the foundation. His bodyguard, a wide-shouldered man named Garrett, noticed the shift instantly. He stepped forward, hand moving to his earpiece. Amara stopped in front of Dominic. She looked up at him with the absolute, uncomplicated confidence that only 3-year-olds possess. She held up the scarf. "You dropped this," she said. 3 words. Child's voice. High and clear as a bell. Dominic Ashford did not move for 7 full seconds. What do you think he saw when he looked at her face? What could a 3-year-old possibly have that would make one of the most powerful men in the country stop breathing? Garrett's voice came through tight and low. "Sir, do you want me to?" "No." Dominic's voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't." He crouched down to her level. The charcoal suit creased at the knees. This man who did not bend for boardrooms, did not bow for cameras, did not soften for anyone. He crouched down until he was looking directly into the eyes of a 3-year-old girl on a train platform. And his hands were shaking. Nana Celeste arrived at Amara's side, breathless and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, sir. She just picked it up, she didn't mean any harm, she just wanted to." "It's fine." His eyes hadn't left Amara's face. "What's her name?" The question landed strangely. "Not thank you. Not no harm done." Not the polished dismissal of a man who has somewhere to be. "What's her name?" Nana Celeste hesitated for just half a second. The kind of hesitation that lives in the body before the brain approves it. "Amara," she said carefully. Something moved through Dominic Ashford's face. Something that looked like grief wearing the mask of recognition. He took the scarf gently from Amara's hands. And he whispered something. So low that Garrett couldn't hear it. So low that Nana Celeste couldn't catch it. But Amara heard it. And she would repeat it to her grandmother 2 hours later, word for word in the back of a cab. And Nana Celeste would go completely, icily still. The secret had just taken its first step out of the dark. She had been waiting for this day for 3 years. She had prayed it would never come. Nana Celeste's real name was Celestine Okafor, 61 years old. Retired schoolteacher. The kind of woman who kept a Bible on the nightstand and a list of emergency contacts laminated on the fridge. She was practical. She was organized. She was the kind of grandmother who labeled everything. Leftovers, medicine bottles, school forms, because in her experience, the things that went unlabeled had a way of becoming dangerous. She had labeled everything in Amara's life. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. The cab moved through morning traffic, the city gray and indifferent outside the fogged windows. Amara was in her car seat, legs dangling, humming something tuneless and content, entirely unbothered by what had just happened on that platform. 3-year-olds carry no weight forward. Every moment is already complete and abandoned. Amara had returned the scarf and moved on. For her it was done. For Celeste it had just begun. She kept her face turned toward the window. She didn't want Amara to see her expression. She had been a schoolteacher for 31 years. She knew how to manage a classroom, how to project calm over chaos, how to ensure that the storm inside her never reached the children in her care. But her hands in her lap were pressed flat against her thighs, pressing down hard. Have you ever known something you wished you could unknow? Something you tucked so deep inside yourself you almost convinced yourself it wasn't real, until the world dragged it back into the light. That was Celeste right now. The cab hit a red light, and in the sudden stillness, Amara looked up from where she'd been picking at a loose thread on her coat sleeve. "Nana." "Yes, baby." The tall man. Celeste's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What about him, sweetheart?" "He said something." "Did he?" "Keep the voice light. Keep it easy. Keep it the voice of a woman with nothing to be afraid of." "He said." Amara scrunched her face with a concentrated effort of exact memory that small children sometimes achieve. terrifyingly without trying. You have her eyes. The cab moved forward through the green light. Celeste did not. You have her eyes. The sentence was 6 syllables. 6 syllables and 35 years of history compressed inside them like a grenade someone had just placed quietly on a table. She knew whose eyes Dominic Ashford was referring to. She had spent 3 years making sure he would never find out those eyes existed. The scarf. That specific scarf. She hadn't seen it clearly in the chaos of the moment, hadn't looked closely enough, but now, turning it over in her mind, the dark burgundy, the gold thread pattern, she knew exactly what it was. She had seen its twin once before. In a photograph. In a box she kept on the highest shelf of her closet, behind winter blankets. Inside a manila envelope she had never opened in front of anyone. The pattern wasn't decorative. It was a family crest. Why would a man like Dominic Ashford be wearing a family crest on a Wednesday morning at a public train station? And why, in a city of 2 million people, had he been standing on the exact platform where Celeste had brought Amara for the very first time? She pulled out her phone, opened the recent calls, found the number she hadn't dialed in over a year, the number she'd saved under a fake name, a name that meant nothing to anyone who might scroll through her contacts, a name she'd chosen specifically because it was forgettable. She didn't call it. Not yet. She stared at it for a long time. Then she looked at Amara, who had gone back to her loose thread, humming again, small and perfect and entirely unaware that she was the center of a universe of secrets. Celeste had made a promise. She had made it over a hospital bed, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and failing flowers, to a young woman whose hand she had held as the life went out of it. She had made a promise in the particular silence that follows a last breath, the silence that is somehow louder than everything that came before. I will protect her. Whatever it costs, I will protect her. She had kept that promise for 3 years. But Dominic Ashford had looked into Amara's eyes today. And now the promise was going to cost something she hadn't budgeted for. She put her phone back in her bag. She looked out the window. And she began, quietly and systematically, to calculate exactly how much damage had been done in those 7 frozen seconds on Platform 9, and whether it was already too late to contain it. Because the worst thing about a man like Dominic Ashford wasn't that he was powerful. It was that he had people, quiet, efficient, invisible people, whose entire job was to find things out. And as of 7:42 this morning, he had something to find. What Garrett found in 47 minutes would have taken most investigators 3 days. This is the chapter where everything you think you know about this story shifts. Hold on to that. Garrett's full name was Garrett Finch. Former intelligence. The kind of former that means the skills never left, only the badge did. He had worked for Dominic Ashford for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had learned 2 things about his employer with absolute certainty. Dominic Ashford did not shake. And Dominic Ashford did not crouch. He had done both today. For a 3-year-old girl who'd returned a scarf. Garrett ran the station footage within 20 minutes of leaving the platform. He had contacts at Northgate's private security firm. A favor called in quietly, the way favors of that kind always are, with a number spoken softly over a phone and no paper trail attached. The footage was clear, crisp. He watched it 3 times. The girl, the scarf, Dominic's face. He had worked in intelligence long enough to recognize the specific expression Dominic wore in that moment. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't sentimentality. It was recognition colliding with something that had been believed, deeply and completely, to be impossible. He started a trace on the grandmother next. Standard methodology. Cab company destination payment method. Within 22 minutes, he had an address in the Elmfield district. Name: Celestine Okafor. Retired teacher. Clean record. No flags. And then he found the connection. This is where you need to pay absolute attention because this detail, this single detail, reframes everything that happened on that platform. It wasn't in any public database. It wasn't something a standard background check would surface. Garrett found it because he was the kind of man who didn't stop at the obvious door. He looked for the door behind the door. It was in a private hospital record from 4 years ago, accessed through a contact who should not have been able to provide it and who would never confirm having done so. Patient admission. A maternity ward. St. Bridget's Private Hospital. The patient's name. Imani Okafor. 22 years old at time of admission. Celestine Okafor listed as next of kin. And the name on the paternity acknowledgement form, unsigned, contested, and subsequently sealed by legal order, was Dominic Ashford. Garrett sat very still in the back of the car for a long time. He looked at the document on his tablet. Then he looked out the window at the city moving past. Do you understand what this means? Do you see what Dominic didn't know, what he couldn't have known, until a little girl held up a silk scarf on a platform this morning? Dominic had been told the child didn't survive. He had been told this by people he trusted. By a lawyer. By a woman who had managed to make the problem disappear so completely that he had never had cause to question it. He had been told there was no child. He had been told to move forward. He had written a check, a large one, and moved forward because that was what a man in his position did when a situation became complicated, and because grief, real or manufactured, has a way of making people accept what they're told rather than ask what they know. He had grieved. In his own private, sealed-off, never-spoken-of way, Dominic Ashford had grieved a child he believed had died. And this morning, that child had walked up to him on Platform 9 and handed him a scarf. With her mother's eyes. Garrett called Dominic. One ring. Tell me what you found. Dominic's voice was back to its controlled register, but there was something underneath it, something that had been cracked open and wasn't going to close again. Sir. Garrett paused. In 6 years he had delivered bad news, dangerous news, complicated news. He had never once paused before delivering it. You need to be somewhere private for this. Silence on the line. Tell me, Dominic said. And his voice, just this once, was not the voice of a billionaire. It was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something enormous, looking down. So Garrett told him. And somewhere across the city, in a cab that had already reached the Elmfield district, Celestine Okafor was walking Amara up the steps of a narrow brownstone house, and feeling, in the particular way that people who have been bracing for impact feel it, that the ground beneath her was beginning to move. Neither of them knew yet that there was a third person who had been watching this entire situation for a very long time. Someone who had arranged things. Someone who had made sure Dominic received that particular scarf as a gift. Someone who had known, with cold precision, exactly what would happen if the right object ended up on the right bench at the right time. Someone who had been waiting 3 years for Amara to be old enough to walk toward a stranger on her own. The scarf wasn't lost. It was placed. Her name was Margaret Ashford, Dominic's mother. And she had known about Amara since the day the child was born. Margaret Ashford was 70 years old and had the posture of a woman who had never once apologized for taking up space. She lived in the original Ashford estate on the north edge of the city. 11 rooms, 2 staircases, a garden that had been photographed for 3 architectural magazines, and a study on the second floor where she had made more important decisions than most governments. She was in that study when Dominic called. She had been expecting his call since 7:50 a.m. You knew, he said. No greeting. No preamble. 3 years of Margaret Ashford's son learning to conduct himself like a man who controlled rooms. And it had all collapsed into 2 words the moment the truth hit him. Yes, she said. The word landed in the phone call like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret heard her son's breathing change, the way it had changed once before, when he was 9 years old and had discovered that the dog he'd been told was sent to a farm had in fact been put down. The breathing of someone whose version of reality has just been revised without their consent. She's alive, he said. She is. You told me. I told you what needed to be said at the time. Margaret's voice was measured. Not cruel. but absolutely without flinching. You were 25 when Imani came into your life. You were about to close the Ridgeline acquisition. The situation was, her name is Amara. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Just slightly. Just enough. She's 3 years old. She walked up to me this morning and gave me my scarf back, and she has her mother's eyes and you. He stopped. Collected himself with visible effort. Where is Imani? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. In terms of Margaret Ashford, who was not a woman given to pauses, 3 seconds was a geological age. Can you feel what's coming? Are you holding your breath right now the way everyone in that moment was? Dominic, she said quietly. Imani passed away 14 months after Amara was born. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It wasn't the silence of a man bracing for information. It was the silence of a man receiving a blow he hadn't seen coming, even though some part of him, somewhere very deep and very honest, had already known. How, he said. One word. Flat. Complications. She was unwell after the birth. Celestine was her grandmother, the only family she had left. She raised the child. Margaret paused again. I made sure they were financially provided for. Anonymously. I have been watching over the girl since. You have been watching over my daughter. His voice had gone very quiet. The quietest kind of fury. Without telling me she existed. I made a judgment call. You made a... He stopped again. Pressed it down. When he spoke again, he had rebuilt the wall, brick by controlled brick, and his voice came from behind it. I want Celeste Okafor's address. Dominic, you need to think carefully about how you... The address, mother. What would you do in his position? If you discovered that the child you'd been told was gone had been alive, living in your own city, for 3 years, watched over by the woman who had taken everything from you without your knowledge. Margaret gave him the address. She did it because she had calculated, 35 years into the business of managing her son's life, that there were certain moments where resistance only made things worse. This was one of them. The scarf had done what it was meant to do. The meeting had happened the way she'd designed it to happen. She hadn't done this to be cruel. She had done it because Amara deserved to be found. And because Margaret Ashford, for all her architecture of control and precision, had held that little girl once. Just once, in a brief unsanctioned visit she had arranged through Celeste 2 years ago, and had felt something move in her chest that she had not felt since Dominic himself was small. She had watched the girl sleep. And she had made a decision that she had spent a year building into motion. The scarf was the mechanism. Platform 9 was the design. But even Margaret hadn't accounted for one thing. One person. One variable she had dismissed as resolved. That was, in fact, very much not resolved. The lawyer who had handled the original arrangement. The one who had told Dominic there was no child. The one who had been paid generously to make that information disappear. He had been watching the Ashford family ever since. And he had just received an alert on his phone. Footage from Northgate Central Station. Little girl. A man in a charcoal suit. A burgundy scarf. And he was already making a phone call of his own. The lawyer's name was Stephen Price. And he had not simply been paid to hide the truth. He had been paid to manufacture a replacement one. This is the chapter that changes what you thought you understood about everyone in this story. Stephen Price was 53 years old. Silver-haired, soft-spoken, with an office in the financial district that communicated trustworthiness through its carpet alone. Thick, neutral, expensive. He had handled sensitive matters for 3 of the city's wealthiest families over a 20-year career. He was, by all visible measurements, a man of discretion. What he was, in fact, was a man who kept copies of everything. Not for protection. Not for insurance exactly. For architecture. Stephen Price believed that information was a structure, and that the person who held the most load-bearing pieces was the person who could never truly be demolished. He had files on things that could end careers, dissolve marriages, redirect inheritances. He kept them in a system so carefully encrypted and distributed that even his own partners didn't know the full scope of what he held. He had a file on Dominic Ashford that was 47 pages long. But the file on Margaret Ashford was 212. Are you starting to see the shape of this? Are you beginning to understand that almost everything you've been told in this story has had at least one more layer underneath it? What Stephen Price knew, what he had been paid to know and then paid to forget, was that Margaret Ashford's instruction 4 years ago had not been simply to make Dominic believe the child hadn't survived. The original instruction had been more extreme than that. The original instruction had been to make the child actually disappear. Not through harm. Margaret was calculating, but she was not that. The instruction had been adoption. A closed, sealed, internationally processed adoption that would have placed Amara, then not yet born, still referred to in the files only as the matter, with a family abroad. A family that had no connection to anyone named Ashford. A family who would raise her without any knowledge of her origins. Celeste Okafor had refused. Celeste had refused with a particular ferocity of a woman who has already buried too many people she loves and will not, cannot be made to bury one more. She had refused in Margaret Ashford's own sitting room, face to face, without raising her voice, in the way that people who have survived enormous things can refuse. Completely, and without the possibility of negotiation. And Margaret, who had sat across from politicians and corporate raiders and men twice her size, had looked at Celestine Okafor and understood that she had met the one variable in her architecture that would not bend. So they had reached an agreement. Amara would stay with Celeste. Margaret would provide for them anonymously. Dominic would never know. Stephen would seal the records and walk away with a number that made the walking easy. The agreement had held for 3 years. Until Margaret had broken it herself. Why? Why would the woman who had built this entire architecture of concealment decide, 3 years later, to dismantle it? What changed? Stephen Price knew what had changed. He had known for 8 months. Dominic Ashford had been diagnosed with a hereditary cardiac condition. Not immediately life-threatening. Manageable with treatment. But the kind of diagnosis that makes a man think about legacy in ways he hadn't before. The kind of diagnosis that makes a 70-year-old mother look at everything she has built and ask herself what it's for. Margaret had started visiting Amara more frequently 6 months ago. Celeste had allowed it, cautiously, watchfully, but had allowed it. She had watched the old woman sit on the floor of the living room and read picture books to a child who had no idea who she was. She had watched something shift in Margaret that she recognized, because she had felt it herself the first time she'd held Amara in the hospital room where Imani lay exhausted and radiant and already, though none of them knew it yet, beginning to fail. Some children arrive in the world and you understand, instantly and without explanation, that they are necessary. That they are the kind of presence that reorders everything around them. Amara was that kind of child. And Margaret had finally admitted it. But Stephen Price didn't care about any of that. Stephen Price cared about the fact that if Dominic Ashford found his daughter, if he acknowledged her legally, formally, publicly, then the sealed records became relevant again. Then the original agreement became a liability. Then the 212 pages in Margaret's file became either a weapon or a target, depending on who moved first. He placed a call to a journalist he had used before. Careful journalist. The kind who knew how to receive information without leaving fingerprints. "I have something," he said. "It involves the Ashford family. It involves a child. And it involves a level of orchestration that your readers are going to find very difficult to believe." He paused. "I need 48 hours to get everything into order. After that, I give you everything." He hung up. And across the city, a car with a man in a charcoal suit was pulling up outside a narrow brownstone house in the Elmfield district, and the man inside it had no idea that someone had just started a clock. The betrayal wasn't Dominic hiding from his daughter. It wasn't Margaret hiding the daughter from Dominic. The betrayal was the man who had been trusted to protect everyone, and had spent 3 years deciding how best to profit from them all. Celeste heard the car door first. She had spent the entire cab ride home deciding what she would do if this moment came, and now it was here, and every plan she had made dissolved the second she heard that specific sound, the expensive, well-engineered, almost silent close of a luxury car door, the kind that doesn't slam, the kind that seals. She was in the kitchen. Amara was in the living room, arranging a small army of stuffed animals into what appeared to be a very important meeting. There was a bear at the head of the arrangement. Amara was giving the bear instructions. Celeste moved to the front window before the knock came. She saw the car. Saw Garrett standing beside it, eyes moving across the street with the practiced patience of a man trained to read environments. Saw Dominic Ashford standing at the bottom of her front steps, looking up at the door. He wasn't wearing the charcoal jacket anymore. At some point between the station and now he had taken it off, and he stood in just his shirt, white, slightly rumpled, collar open, and he looked for the first time like a person rather than a position. He looked like a man who had been crying in a car. What would you do if you had spent 3 years protecting a secret you kept out of love, out of a promise made to a dying woman, and the person you'd been protecting it from was standing outside your door looking like that? The knock came. 3 times. Not aggressive. Almost tentative. Celeste stood at the window for another 10 seconds. Then she walked to the door. She opened it without a chain, without hiding behind it, without any of the mechanisms of caution. She opened it the way she'd opened every hard conversation in her life. Fully and with her feet planted. Dominic Ashford looked at her. She was smaller than he'd expected somehow. 61 years old, 5'4", wearing a blue cardigan and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She held herself the way very strong people hold themselves, completely still, with no wasted motion. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Ms. Okafor." He held her gaze. "I think you know why I'm here." "I do." Silence between them. On the street, a bird was making a lot of noise in a tree. Traffic moved past the end of the block. Somewhere in the house behind Celeste, a small voice was explaining something at length to a stuffed bear. "She sounds like her," Dominic said quietly. "Her voice." Celeste's expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. The faintest softening around the eyes. The recognition of something shared. Grief doesn't disappear when you're the only one in the room who's allowed to show it. Just gets very heavy. "She does," Celeste said. "Can I?" He stopped. Tried again. His jaw worked. "I'm not here to take anything. I'm not here to complicate your life. I don't." He pressed a hand flat against the door frame, briefly, steadying. "I just need to see her. Just to see her. That's all I'm asking for right now." Celeste looked at him for a long time. She had prepared arguments. She had prepared conditions, boundaries, the language of protection. She had a lawyer's number in her phone. Not Stephen Price, someone else. Someone who had helped her set up the legal guardianship 3 years ago and who had made very sure it was ironclad. She didn't reach for any of it. Because the man in front of her wasn't a threat in this moment. He was a father. And she had made a promise to Imani. But Imani had also told her something else. Something she'd said in that hospital room, quiet and certain, in one of the last conversations they'd had. Something Celeste had held onto but never known what to do with, until right now. "If he ever finds out," Imani had said, "don't fight him, Nana. He's not a bad man. He just didn't know how to be brave yet." Celeste stepped back from the door. "Wipe your face first," she said, not unkindly. "She notices everything." Dominic Ashford wiped his face. And Celeste led him down the narrow hallway, past the photographs on the wall. Imani at 8 years old, Imani at 16, Imani in a yellow dress at her college graduation, Imani holding a newborn with an expression of absolute wonder, and into the living room, where a 3-year-old girl in a yellow coat was explaining to a stuffed bear that the meeting would need to be rescheduled. Amara looked up. She looked at the tall man from the station. "Hi," she said, with the complete indifference of a child who has already moved on. Dominic Ashford sat down on the floor. In his white dress shirt, with his silver cufflinks and his mirror-polished shoes. He sat down on the carpet of a small house in Elmfield and looked at his daughter. "Hi," he said. "You dropped the scarf," Amara told him with faint reproach, as though this remained relevant. "I did," he said. "I'm sorry about that." She considered him. Handed him a rabbit. "You can be in the meeting," she said generously. "But the bear is in charge." Something cracked open in Dominic Ashford's chest right then. Something that had been sealed for 3 years, or maybe 38, or maybe longer. He looked at this child who had her mother's eyes and her great-grandmother's precision and her own absolute brilliant self, and he held the rabbit the way you hold things you are terrified of dropping. In the hallway, Celeste leaned against the wall and pressed her hand over her mouth. She was not crying. She was thinking about Stephen Price, because she had received a text 20 minutes ago from a source she trusted, warning her that something was in motion, that the sealed records were at risk, that someone was talking to a journalist. The meeting in the living room was just beginning. The storm outside it was already moving. Everything had just changed, and the most dangerous chapter was still to come. The story you have been watching was not about a scarf. It was never about the scarf. Let me tell you what it was really about. 3 years before Amara was born, Imani Okafor, 21 years old, brilliant, studying architecture, a girl who drew floor plans in the margins of her notebooks, had met Dominic Ashford at a charity event where she'd been working as part of a student volunteer program. He was 35. She was 21. He was in the middle of a decade of building something enormous, and she was in the beginning of what should have been a life. They had not been a love story exactly. They had been a collision. Two people who recognized something in each other and moved toward it before either of them had the vocabulary to explain why. He was not cruel to her. He was not predatory. He was simply catastrophically unable to be what she needed, unable to be present in the ways that mattered, unable to choose her over the machinery of his own ambition when the moment came. When she told him she was pregnant, he had panicked, not with malice, with the particular cowardice of a person who knows the right thing and cannot yet find the courage for it. He had gone to his mother. He had let Margaret handle it. He had told himself this was for the best for everyone, and he had allowed that lie to carry him forward because forward was the only direction he knew. He had not known Margaret would take it as far as she did. He had not known about Celeste's refusal, about the agreement, about Imani's health failing in the year after Amara's birth, a complication that the doctors had first dismissed, then taken seriously, then been unable to reverse. He had not known that Imani had died at 23 years old in a private room at St. Bridget's, with her grandmother holding one hand and a photograph of Amara, 10 months old, already laughing at things no one else could see, propped against the water glass on her nightstand. He had not known any of it. And that matters enormously. Because the man who sat on the floor with the rabbit was not the same man who had panicked at 35. People are not fixed. They are not the worst version of themselves forever. But here is the final truth. The one that changes the shape of everything. Stephen Price called the journalist. The journalist called Dominic's communications director. And Dominic's communications director, a woman named Petra who had worked for him for 4 years and was precisely the kind of person you want in a crisis, had walked into the living room of Celeste's house at 4:15 p.m., while Amara was napping in the next room, and placed a printed email on the coffee table. The email was the journalist's preliminary inquiry. 23 questions. Every one of them knowing. Every one of them precise. Dominic read it. Then he looked at Celeste. Then he looked at Petra. "How long do we have?" he said. "If we do nothing, the story runs in 48 hours. It frames you as someone who abandoned a child and paid to have it concealed. frames your mother as the architect. It frames Celeste as. Petra paused. Cooperative with the concealment. Potentially for financial gain. Celeste's expression did not change. But her hands pressed flat on her thighs, the way they had in the cab this morning. That last part is not true, Dominic said flatly. I know. But it's what will be implied. Dominic stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out at the street where Garrett was still standing next to the car, patient and professional, and entirely unaware of what was being decided in this room. What do you do when protecting the people you love means exposing everything you've spent years hiding? When the only way to tell the truth is to let it take you apart first. He made his decision in 30 seconds. He called his communications director back and gave her 2 instructions. The first, arrange a meeting with the journalist. Tomorrow. Full access. No conditions. The second, call his legal team. Not to fight. To begin the formal process of paternity acknowledgement, and to establish what form of presence in Amara's life Celeste would be comfortable with. On Celeste's terms, at Celeste's pace, with Celeste's complete authority preserved. Then he called his mother. It's over, Margaret, he said. Was. I know, she said. And her voice, for the first time in this story, sounded like something other than architecture. It sounded like a very old woman who had carried something very heavy for a very long time, and was, quietly and privately, relieved to put it down. You designed this, he said. The scarf. Platform. All of it. Yes. You could have just told me. You weren't ready to hear it, she said. You needed to see her first. He was quiet for a long moment. You were right, he said. I hate that you were right. I know, she said again. The story ran 2 days later. Dominic had given the journalist everything, including the parts that made him look afraid and fallible and human. The article was not the demolition Stephen Price had designed. It was something stranger and more complicated than that. It was a story about what people do when they're too frightened to be brave, and what happens when the world gives them a second chance anyway. Price's files were subpoenaed 3 months later in a separate matter entirely, having nothing to do with the Ashfords. The architecture he had spent 20 years building collapsed with the specific, complete efficiency of structures that were never meant to last. Amara continued running her meetings. The bear remained in charge. A 3-year-old girl picked up a scarf. She didn't do it to change the world. She did it because it was on the floor and it was someone's, and that was enough reason for her. 3 years old. No agenda. No strategy. No awareness of the 35 years of secrets she was carrying in her small hands. Just a child doing the simple thing. And the simple thing unraveled everything that the complicated things had built. Here is what this story taught me. We spend enormous amounts of energy hiding what we're afraid of. We build systems. We pay people. We make agreements in rooms with no windows. And then a child picks up a scarf, and the whole architecture of our fear gets one honest look at itself. Dominic Ashford lost things when that story ran. Business relationships. A degree of the invulnerability that wealth provides. He lost the version of himself he'd been pretending to be. He gained a daughter. He sat on her bedroom floor and read to her every Sunday for the rest of that year, with the bear listening from the corner. And he learned what it means to be present for someone who doesn't need anything from you except your company. Celeste Okafor got nothing she didn't already have. Which is the point. She had already done the brave thing years ago in a hospital room, when it cost everything and nobody was watching. The world didn't give her a reward. It just finally stopped asking her to carry the secret alone. And here is the question I want to leave you with, the one I want you to sit with tonight. If someone you loved had spent years hiding a truth from you, not out of cruelty but out of fear, and the moment of revelation finally came, would you choose to understand them? Or would you choose to be right? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, hit like. Takes 1 second and it tells me to keep going. Subscribe if you haven't. These stories find the people who need them. Maybe it found you for a reason. And when you're ready, the next story is already waiting. It's about a woman who kept a stranger's lost letter for 20 years before she finally opened it. You think you know what was inside. Don't you there?